It was a cold Wednesday afternoon, and I remember it clearly. I had been dealing with issues in my kitchen sink for weeks. What started as a minor drip soon became a significant leak, and after trying to handle it myself, I finally decided to call a plumber. His name was Alex. I had never met him before but had heard good things about his work, so I assumed it would be a quick fix. When he arrived, I opened the door and was surprised he was much younger than I had anticipated, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, tall, muscular, with broad shoulders and good-looking. I welcomed him warmly and guided him into the kitchen where the leak was. That morning I had put on a nice robe, nothing too flashy, just something light and comfortable. When I noticed the brief glance Alex gave me, I felt a tiny spark. As he started working under the sink, I found myself standing nearby, watching him. I couldn't quite explain it, but something about him intrigued me. Maybe it was the confident way he moved, or the fact that I hadn't had company in a while. Whatever it was, I felt something stir inside me. I began chatting with him, asking about his day and how long he'd been a plumber. He was polite, responding without looking up much, but I detected a hint of nervousness in his voice, like he was trying hard to focus on the task and not on me. It was endearing, and I couldn't help but smile. At one point I reached out and touched his shoulder, a light, innocent squeeze. I could feel him tense up beneath my hand. "You're really strong," I commented, knowing it made him a bit uncomfortable. He looked up at me, startled, but I just gave him a soft smile. He tried to shift away, but I wasn't ready to let him go just yet. I moved a little closer, pretending to be interested in his work. "Need any help?" I asked, knowing he didn't. I adjusted my robe slightly, letting it slip a bit off my shoulder. Alex didn't say anything, but I saw his face flush as he concentrated on the pipes. I crouched beside him, and as I leaned closer, my hand brushed against his arm. He stiffened again, but I didn't pull away. The air between us felt charged, electric, and I could tell he sensed it too. Slowly I stood up, inching closer to him. He was still bent under the sink, trying hard to ignore the tension. I waited until he gathered his tools and stood up, and that's when I made my move. I leaned in, close enough for him to feel my breath on his neck. "Is there anything else you could help me with?" I asked, my voice soft but suggestive. His eyes widened, but he didn't respond right away. I could see him grappling with how to react, so I nudged him gently, my hand sliding down his arm to make my intentions clear. Without waiting for an answer, I leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was subtle at first, just a soft, gentle kiss, but I felt him freeze, and I knew I had overstepped. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking into the cabinets, panic evident in his eyes. I'm just here to fix the sink," he stammered, his voice shaky. I chuckled softly. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs fixing?" I teased, stepping closer, my lips just inches from his. I could see him wrestling with what to do, whether to stay or leave. His hands were trembling as he hurriedly packed up his tools. "There's something else you could take care of for me," I whispered, leaning in as if to kiss him again. But before I could, he backed away, raising his hands as if to ward me off. "I can't," he said, shaking his head. "I really can't," I pouted, feeling a little let down, but I knew he wouldn't give in. He was flustered, quickly gathering his things. I watched him leave, feeling a small thrill from the whole encounter. I hadn't expected him to resist that much, but it was fun to see how far I could push his buttons. Maybe next time, though who knows. That day I let him leave, but there was something off about the way he went. It wasn't just the awkwardness, it was the tension lingering in the air. I realized that Alex's refusal wasn't about lack of interest, it was like he was holding back, torn between doing the right thing and giving in. His eyes gave him away. The hesitation before he left showed he wanted to stay, but didn't trust himself to manage the situation. Days passed, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. Every time I passed the sink, I remembered how flustered he got when I touched his arm, the way his breath quickened when I kissed him on the cheek. It was thrilling. I hadn't felt that kind of spark with anyone in a long time, especially not with someone younger. Honestly, I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he had decided not to come back after what happened. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when I answered, it was Alex. "Hey, this is Alex, the plumber. I was just checking to see if everything's okay with the sink. Did the fix hold up? His voice was polite and professional, but there was a slight tremble underneath. I smiled. "Oh, Alex, how nice of you to call," I said, trying to keep it casual, even though I knew exactly where this might lead. "You know, funny you should ask. The sink is fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom. It's probably nothing major, but I'd feel better if a professional checked it out." There was a pause on the other end, as I imagined him weighing his options. "I can be there in about an hour," he finally replied. When I hung up, a rush of excitement washed over me. This time I had no plans of letting him off so easily. I knew he felt something, even if he was trying to deny it, and I was determined to push things a little further. When Alex arrived, he was noticeably more nervous than before. His usual confident air was still present, but there was hesitation in his steps. "Hugh," he muttered, looking around as if trying to focus on anything but me. I led him upstairs, pointing out the small issue with the faucet. It wasn't leaking, but the handle had become loose. He knelt to inspect it, concentrating on his work, but I could tell he was more aware of me than ever. I stood just behind him, watching in silence, the unspoken tension between us thickening the air. Finally, I couldn't resist. "Alex," I said softly, "I've been thinking about you." He paused, his grip on the faucet tightening. "You have." His voice was cautious, as if unsure whether to acknowledge what had happened before. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about last time." I continued, stepping closer. "You seemed interested but held back. Why was that?" He didn't respond immediately, but I saw his knuckles whiten as he focused on the faucet. "It's just, I'm a professional," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "It wouldn't be right." I moved even closer, feeling the warmth radiating from him. "Who decides what's right or wrong, Alex? We're both adults, and there's clearly something between us. You feel it too, don't you?" I watched him intently, waiting. His breathing quickened, and his hands shook slightly as he tightened the handle. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were filled with conflict. He was trying so hard to remain professional, but I could see the struggle. "You don't have to fight it," I whispered, stepping nearer, my hand brushing against his chest. I could feel his heartbeat racing beneath my fingers. "No one has to know. It's just you and me." He looked down at me, his jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might leave again. But then, suddenly, he grabbed my arm, pulling me closer. It wasn't harsh, but firm, and it caught me off guard. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice intense. "This isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, a smile forming on my lips. The tension between us felt electric, crackling in the air, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes you just have to let go." He hesitated, just for a second, but then he leaned in and kissed me. This wasn't the hesitant peck from before. It was deep, passionate, like all his restraint had finally shattered. I kissed him back, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him close. In those moments, the world faded away. There was only Alex, his hands gripping my waist, his lips on mine, and the heat between us that had been building for days. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, and I could see in his eyes that there was no turning back. "What now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I smiled and took a small step back, just enough to give him some space, but not too much. "I think you know the answer, Alex. We've already crossed the line. Why stop now?" He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. With one last look at the door, he reached for me again, and this time there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. We were fully in it, and neither of us was pulling back. Let's just say that afternoon, the bathroom wasn't the only thing that got fixed. That afternoon was unlike anything I had experienced in years. As soon as Alex kissed me, all the tension and unspoken desire between us erupted into something we couldn't control. He pulled me close, his hands tracing my back as his lips pressed against mine, more confident and intense now. I could feel everything he'd been holding back. We didn't even make it out of the bathroom at first. He gently pushed me against the wall, his hands moving over my shoulders, waist and hips. His touch was firm but considerate, like he was letting go without wanting to overstep. But I didn't mind. I wanted him to let go. His lips moved from my mouth to my neck, and I let out a soft gasp. He paused, as if to make sure I was okay, and when I didn't stop him, he continued, his kisses becoming more urgent and desperate. It felt like all the time he'd spent denying this moment had built into something we couldn't resist. Eventually, we had to stop, if only to catch our breath. We stood there, pressed together, panting like we'd just run a marathon. His forehead rested against mine, and for a moment we were both silent, absorbing what had happened. "I've never done anything like this," Alex murmured, his voice husky. I shouldn't have. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath his shirt. "There's nothing wrong with letting go sometimes, Alex. We're adults, we can make our own choices." I smiled softly, hoping to ease the guilt I could see creeping into his expression. He chuckled nervously. "You make it sound so simple. It is simple," I insisted, stepping back a little, but keeping my hand on him. "You've been holding back. Why? Because of some imaginary line between right and wrong. Sometimes you just have to follow what feels good." He stayed quiet for a moment, just staring at me with an intense, unreadable look. Finally, he let out a long breath, like he was releasing all the tension he'd been carrying. I guess I needed to hear that. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. Once we had both calmed down, I led him downstairs, and we sat in the living room, talking in a way we never had before. The conversation wasn't forced or awkward like I'd feared. Instead, we laughed, shared stories, and got to know each other better. Alex opened up about his life, about working as a plumber for nearly a decade after leaving a corporate job he despised. He explained how the routine of fixing things brought him comfort and a sense of control. It made sense. He seemed like the kind of man who needed structure and stability. I shared my own story too, about my marriage and how it ended years ago, leaving me alone but not bitter. I wasn't one to dwell on regrets. I'd had a good life, but for a long time I'd been missing something: companionship, passion. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a reminder that I was still alive. And Alex had given me that, even if only for an afternoon. As the sun began to set, I realized Alex had stayed much longer than he'd intended. "You should probably get going," I said, though part of me wished he'd stay. He hesitated, looking like he didn't want to leave. "Yeah, I guess I should. But I don't want this to end weird. I don't want you to think I was just, I shook my head, smiling at him. "I don't. You're a good man, Alex. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I'm not expecting anything more." He looked relieved, though a bit of confusion still lingered in his eyes, like he wasn't used to things being so straightforward. "So you're really okay with everything? No strange feelings or anything?" I laughed softly. "No, Alex, no strange feelings. It was just one of those moments, no strings, no pressure." He nodded slowly, as if trying to wrap his mind around the simplicity of it all. "Okay," he said after a pause. "I guess I'll see you around." Maybe, I replied playfully. "If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call." That made him smile. He stood, gathering his tools and slinging his bag over his shoulder, but before he left, he turned back one last time. "Margaret, I don't regret it. I just want you to know that." "I don't either," I said softly, watching as he walked out the door. After he left, I sat there, thinking about what had happened. It was one of those rare times when everything fell perfectly into place: no guilt, no shame, just two people letting go of their inhibitions for a little while. In the days that followed, I thought of him occasionally, wondering if he thought of me too, but I didn't call him back. I didn't need to. That afternoon was exactly what it was meant to be: a moment of escape, a reminder that I was still very much alive, still capable of feeling excitement, desire, and spontaneity. As for Alex, I hope he left feeling the same. Sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected connection to remind you that life doesn't have to be lived within the lines. Maybe he went back to his routine, fixing pipes and carrying on with his days, or maybe, just maybe, that afternoon gave him something extra: a new way of seeing things, a way of letting go when the moment felt right. Whatever the case, I wouldn't forget him. And who knows? Maybe the next time something breaks in this house, I'll call him. Or maybe I'll just let fate decide. But for now, I'll cherish that little adventure for what it was: something unexpected, something beautiful, and a reminder that even at 64, life is still full of surprises.